Hello guys, thank you so much for coming back to watch another video on my channel. Now, by looking at the title of the video, you might be wondering as to why I think Resident Evil 2 Remake is the most innovative remake we had, even though we had the masterpiece Resident Evil 4 Remake. Now hold on, before you start commenting down below in the video, I've been very careful with the word I'm using. I'm saying the most innovative, not the best remake, because I'm comparing this remake to the original source material. So keep that in mind while you're watching this video. So without wasting any time, let's find out and let's discuss as to why I think that Resident Evil 2 Remake is the most innovative remake we had from this franchise. And as always, if you do end up liking this video I've made for you, do give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. It would allow me to make more of these videos for you guys. Capcom has been on fire since Resident Evil 7, and they have been delivering one of the best games out there for this franchise. Whether we're talking about the mainline titles or we're talking about the remakes, but they have been delivering the best quality product out there for the fans. Especially when we're talking about the most recent remakes. Resident Evil 2 Remake was a masterpiece. Resident Evil 3 Remake, even though it was controversial, it was still a good remake. And then we're talking about the most recent remake, which is Resident Evil 4 Remake, and to be honest, that game is also a masterpiece for me, especially the DLC. If you have not played the Ada's campaign, I think this game deserved to be among the top best games of all time. Now, saying that, Resident Evil 4 Remake didn't deviate much from the original masterpiece, which was Resident Evil 4, and that game has been remastered for the more modern technologies and more modern consoles and more modern platforms, and the game has seen multiple graphical updates on PC and has been released on PlayStation 4, and even you can play it now on PS5. So overall structure for Resident Evil 4 Remake to use was already present. The game still looked decent even if you play it today, so I think Resident Evil 4 Remake didn't have to deviate much from the original source materials. For me, Resident Evil 4 Remake is a much better version of Resident Evil 4, and Resident Evil 4 for me was a masterpiece, and same goes for Resident Evil 4 Remake. So they didn't have to do much of an experiment with that game, because this base game and the base skeleton or the structure of the game was already present. They just had to add more features into the game, which is much appreciated, but wasn't creative as much as Resident Evil 2 Remake was from the original game. So here's a list of the things I personally think which makes Resident Evil 2 Remake is the most innovative game out of the franchise. Now, the first main thing you would notice, which is the most obvious one, is the graphical changes and the gameplay changes compared to the original Resident Evil 2. Now, long gone the tank control system, and you have now brand new perspective as a third person over the shoulder where you can actually observe the environment, observe the RPD station, where on the original Resident Evil 2 you weren't sure what's around the corner. Now, this was the most innovative change they've applied on Resident Evil 2 Remake. They could have gone down the first person perspective, which I personally would have loved, but I think a lot of people don't appreciate that. So I think they found the right balance, because even if you play it third person over the shoulder, the game could have actually been a more action rather than a survival horror game, but they kept it so well that the game played in a similar mechanics as Resident Evil 4 Remake, but still maintained a survival horror aspect. And the game graphics added another layer to it, because they went with a more realistic tone with the graphics on Resident Evil 2 Remake, which added more realism to the game. And even the graphics, especially when we're talking about how the lighting works in the brand new RE engine, it looks amazing how the game looks, how the reflection is shown on the characters, the models. So I think this overhaul not just been applied on the gameplay, but also they looked on the tiniest detail on the graphic aspects of the game to elevate this game compared to the original Resident Evil 2. And that's not saying that Resident Evil 4 Remake and 3 Remake doesn't look graphically that good and the gameplay hasn't changed, but the game, as I said, Resident Evil 4 Remake especially, it was based on the original Resident Evil 4 game, which still look decent to this day, and it'll pretty much followed the same sort of style, whereas Resident Evil 2 Remake didn't have much to follow on, so it created its own style, which I think perfectly captures the whole environment of Raccoon City in Resident Evil 2 Remake. Another feature in Resident Evil 2 Remake I personally appreciated was how the writing was more serious compared to the original Resident Evil 2. The Resident Evil 2 had really bad acting for its time, and the voice lines and the voice actions were terrible, just like the original Resident Evil 1 was. And even if you look at Resident Evil 4 Remake, it still gives me that sort of B-action vibe movie, whereas Resident Evil 2 Remake took this writing quite seriously. All the actors who've played in these characters looked and sound realistic, and they all have done a fantastic job in the game. And the plot story of the game is very simple, but at the same time is quite effective. You have this rookie cop who's trying to survive this all incident and all this outbreak with the other survivors, and he's trying to uncover the secrets that what Umbrella has been doing in the background. So I think it felt very realistic, natural with how the game progressed throughout the game. For example, you're looking at Lieutenant Marvin, who's stuck in this RPD station. In the original game, he doesn't help you much. He's pretty much stuck himself in that room, and he tells you to leave, and he doesn't tell you much about the game. Whereas in Resident Evil 2 Remake, he has more layer. You try to help either Leon and Claire, and he plays different dialogue options and it says different things to different characters you play in, whether that's a Leon or Claire Redfield. And even Leon, when he's going through that dark RPD station, he's trying to comfort himself by saying that you got this, because that makes it more realistic as to how you would react in that situation. Whereas in Resident Evil 4 Remake, they continue the same sort of B-action sort of vibe. There were some cheesy lines which they kind of copied pasted from the original Resident Evil 4, and even Resident Evil 3 Remake, which was good but wasn't as good as Resident Evil 2 Remake was. Furthermore, people prefer Ada Wong from Resident Evil 2 Remake over Resident Evil 4 Remake due to the change of actor who played this character. So I think overall, the story wise and how the writing works for Resident Evil 2 Remake was way better compared to any remake we've seen from Capcom. Now, one of the best changes they've made was actually the creative changes they've applied in Resident Evil 2 Remake over the original Resident Evil 2. The new thing they've added was a gore mechanic which wasn't present in the original Resident Evil 2. Even though yes, you can pop zombies' head on the original Resident Evil 2, the gore mechanic was the most brilliant thing they've added in the recent Resident Evil remakes. This feature was amazing in Resident Evil 2 Remake, even though it was in Resident Evil 3 Remake, but Resident Evil 3 Remake was dialed down. Same goes for Resident Evil 4 Remake, it wasn't as good as Resident Evil 2 Remake was. Because in Resident Evil 2 Remake, you can cut zombie into little pieces just by using knife. And the zombies' movement actually work in a similar way as to where you shot them. If they can't walk, then they would just drag their body down the floor, and if let's say you shoot them in their head and you get a perfect headshot, then they won't be able to get up. And I think that was more realistic, and that was a very creative idea they've added in Resident Evil 2 Remake. Then the overall changes they've made in how the story plays out and how they've added new locations, let's say Nest, which I personally really enjoyed that place, and I think it was a really plus point in Resident Evil 2 Remake. And how can we forget about Mr. X? Mr. X was present in the original Resident Evil 2, however it was in the very shorter sections of the game where he chases you only just for a smaller segment, whereas in Resident Evil 2 Remake it has this adaptive AI where it can chases you based on the sounds you make, and it continues to chases you. You can actually stop him down for a bit, but it wouldn't work for a long period for you. So I think that was amazing as what they added, and Mr. X actually become a highlight feature of Resident Evil 2 Remake. And Resident Evil 2 Remake also featured one of the best puzzles we've seen in the more recent remakes. Resident Evil 3 Remake does feature some very basic puzzles, same goes for Resident Evil 4 Remake, and Resident Evil 2 Remake actually had a very creative puzzles throughout the game. And this gives you the incentive to explore the area, that you don't need to rush through the game, and it doesn't have that linear approach we've seen in a more recent Resident Evil 4 Remake. Due to the nature of the game, I understand that how Resident Evil 4 Remake works, but whereas Resident Evil 2 Remake didn't have that sort of approach, and it gives you the option that you can explore, you can customize your weapon by adding more things, and then you can look in for every crook and cranny to find the missing objects or items which can add to the experience for Resident Evil 2 Remake. And I think some of the puzzles were quite creative, and at the same time you had to backtrack quite a lot, which I think worked with Resident Evil 2 Remake with sort of environment you're in. Whereas, as I said, the approach we had with the more recent remakes was slightly different compared to Resident Evil 2 Remake was. So for me, I think puzzles was something Resident Evil 2 Remake had actually innovated in a sort of idea and actually did it really well compared to the recent Resident Evil titles we had. And the last thing I would mention that Resident Evil 2 Remake did really well was the replayability of the game. The game wasn't as long as Resident Evil 4 Remake is, and I prefer Resident Evil titles to be very long. However, the Resident Evil 2 Remake plays slightly different compared to the Resident Evil 3 Remake or Resident Evil 4 Remake. You have A scenario and a B scenario. Now you have the choice to either play Leon as for A scenario and Claire for B scenario, or you can choose Claire for A scenario and Leon for B scenario. And due to this, you get different dialogue options with the characters, how they interact. You get different sequences and slightly different scenes where you can go to and explore to. And I think that was really good because you don't have to spend much time that you can play scenario A, then you can go and jump on a scenario B, and that added so much value to your game. And I know the game wasn't as long as Resident Evil 4 Remake was, but that's where it comes in, where you can actually finish the game in one sitting, then you can play a different scenario and see how the game plays out for you. And also, not just that, you had the fourth survivor as Hunk, which plays an actually important role in the story. Hunk is one of my favorite characters from the Resident Evil franchise, and you also get to play this mini game where you play as Tofu. And I know you don't have the mercenary mode, but I think these modes can compensate that quite easily. And yes, Resident Evil 2 Remake doesn't offer mercenary mode, but then you had these what if scenarios where you can play these characters who could have survived and what could have been happened, and I think it add more replayability to the game itself. So I personally think Resident Evil 2 Remake had more replayability compared to Resident Evil 3 Remake or Resident Evil 4 Remake. So what do you guys think? I know some of you are going to disagree with my opinion. Please do let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below in this video. So that's it for the video, guys. I'll catch you again with another video on my channel. Until then, look after yourself. Have a good one.